The winter dawn of December 3, 1287, crept over the stone towers of the Abbey of Saint Martial in central France, a place where the cold pressed into the bones harder than hunger. On that morning, before the sun had fully risen, the bells rang not for prayer, but for the arrival of a new servant. Villagers had gathered at the gatehouse to watch the boy approach, shivering beneath a threadbare wool cloak. His name was Arnaud, barely 9 years old, his cheeks sunken and his eyes widened by a world far older than he was ever meant to face. In medieval Europe, childhood was not a shield but a passageway into labour, obedience, and often a lifetime shaped by the will of the Church. Yet even in a world accustomed to hardship, Arnaud's fate would be remembered as unusually tragic. His father, a tenant farmer who owed dues to the abbey, had died the previous spring during an outbreak of fever that swept the Limoges countryside. His mother, unable to maintain the small plot alone, made a decision born of desperation. She offered her child to the church. The practice was not uncommon. Medieval monastic institutions often accepted young boys for training as servants, pages, or choir novices. The church portrayed this as a charitable act, a path to salvation and structure. But for many children, especially the poorest, it was a surrender of freedom long before their voices had matured. Arnaud was too young to understand the permanence of that decision. All he knew was that the abbey gates, tall and iron, bound, closed behind him with a boom that felt like the sealing of destiny. Inside the cloister, Arnaud faced the immediate reality of monastic life. Boys like him were assigned to the Domus Pauperum, the house of the poor within the abbey, where they performed the tasks older monks no longer wished to do. His first lessons were simple but punishing. Before dawn each day, he swept the refectory floors, scrubbed soot from the kitchen hearthstones, and carried buckets of icy water from the nearby stream. The monks provided food, but barely more than survival rations, barley gruel, a crust of rye bread, and occasionally a ladle of vegetable broth. Yet to a child who had known hunger since infancy, even this felt like a gift. The abbey itself was a world unto its own, shaped by stone and ritual. Founded in the 10th century, Saint Martial had grown into a regional centre of religious scholarship and music. Its scriptorium produced manuscripts treasured for their illuminated initials and chant notations. But behind the grandeur lay a hierarchy that rarely acknowledged the humanity of its lowest servants. Arnaud soon learned that servants were not regarded as students or novices, but as tools to maintain the monastic machine. He moved through the halls silently, always mindful of the rules imposed by the Benedictine order. Silence, obedience, endurance, the triad of survival for the powerless. The boy's first true mentor was Brother Gautier, a middle-aged monk responsible for managing the abbey's young workers. Gautier was stern but not cruel, and he explained the rhythms of the monastic day with the patience of a man who remembered his own difficult youth. Yet his sympathy was limited by duty. To him, Arnaud was one of many. The boy learned to read his expressions, to move quickly when Gautier frowned, and to remain still when he raised his hand in warning. It was a life defined not by nurturing, but by discipline. By the spring of 1288, Arnaud's responsibilities expanded. He was assigned to the cloister gardens, where he tended herbs used by the infirmary monks. The medieval church ran some of the most advanced medical facilities in Europe, but the work behind their remedies was backbreaking. Arnaud gathered wormwood, sage, and yarrow, learning their names long before he understood their purpose. He also accompanied Brother Pascal to the village marketplace, carrying baskets heavier than his small frame could manage. On these trips he saw families together, children playing freely, mothers calling sons home at dusk. Each time he felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, an ache he would later recognize as longing. Despite his circumstances, Arnaud possessed a natural talent that slowly drew the attention of the monastery's most respected figure, Master Hugues, the choir master. One morning, as Arnaud scrubbed wax from the stones near the chapel entrance, He hummed a tune he had heard the monks chant during matins. His voice, though quiet, carried a delicacy and purity that startled Hughes as he passed. Without a word of praise, the choirmaster instructed Gautier to bring the boy to the choir practice room the next day. To the monks, divine music was a sacred offering. A boy with a beautiful voice was an asset valued almost as highly as a trained scribe. Thus began Arnaud's second life inside the abbey. In addition to physical labor, he now trained as a choir servant. He learned Gregorian chant, memorizing sequences in Latin he did not yet understand. Hughes was demanding. A missed note meant extra chores. A weak voice during performance resulted in punishment that could last hours. Still, Arnaud felt a spark of pride that he had never known before. Music became the one space where he felt something close to belonging. Yet talent brought visibility, and visibility brought risk. Not all monks believed a servant boy should share the chapel with novices of wealthy families. Class divisions in medieval Europe were rigid, even within religious orders. Some monks voiced complaints that Arnaud was too lowborn to sing the liturgical responses. Others believed his presence lowered the sanctity of the choir. Hughes defended the boy only because he valued his voice. Compassion had little to do with it. The pressures of Arnaud's dual roles placed a heavy burden on his young body. Late into the evenings, after the monks retired, he continued his chores, washing linen, cleaning chamber pots, polishing candelabras. Sleep became a luxury, and exhaustion clung to him like a shadow. But what weighed on him most was loneliness. His mother, unable to travel, never visited. Letters were impossible for a family that had never learned to write. The world outside the monastery faded into memory. By late 1288, whispers began circulating about reform measures sweeping across monastic communities in Europe. Pressure from bishops and noble patrons demanded stricter discipline and more rigorous spiritual purity. At St. Martial, this meant harsher treatment for servants accused of disobedience or imperfection. The abbot, Bernard de Voissens, announced new measures requiring boys like Arnaud to undergo closer supervision. Any mistake, however small, was seen as a spiritual failing. And so, at 10 years old, Arnaud entered the most difficult phase of his life. The changes would mark him forever. His tragic path, shaped by obedience, hardship, and the rigid structure of medieval religious power, was only beginning. The year 1289 began with a brutal winter that settled over St. Martial Abbey like a shroud. The wind howled through the cloister arches, the stone walls exhaling cold into every chamber. Snow piled along the parapets, and frost formed diamond patterns across the windows of the scriptorium. For Arnaud, now 10 years old, life inside the monastery became harsher with each passing week. The reforms instituted by Abbot Bernard de Voissens were no longer mere words spoken during chapter meetings. They had become the governing force of daily life, shaping every task, every punishment, and every breath the boy took. The new rules were simple in wording but severe in practice. Servants were required to remain silent during all hours except when directly addressed. Chores were increased to ensure constant labor, a measure said to reduce temptation and idleness. Even the choir boys, whose voices were vital to the abbey's prestige, were held to stricter schedules. Arnaud's duties doubled. Before sunrise, he cleaned the cloister walkways. After matins, he tended the herb garden, often breaking ice to reach the soil beneath. At midday, he assisted in the kitchen, carrying sacks of grain and chopping vegetables until his fingers numbed. After vespers, when the monks rested, he was sent to the cellar to turn wine barrels or haul firewood up from storage. Yet amid this crushing workload, Arnaud still trained under Master Hughes. The choirmaster demanded perfection, insisting that the boy's voice must not waver even if his legs trembled from exhaustion. Chant practice often lasted long past the set hours, and on some nights Arnaud fell asleep in the choir stalls, his back pressed against the cold wooden panels. If he missed a note the next morning, Hughes would glare at him with a disappointment that hurt more than any physical punishment. Arnaud learned quickly that emotion had no place in his surroundings. He swallowed his fatigue, his hunger, and often his tears. The abbey's hierarchy became more visible to him during this time. The monks who oversaw finances dined on fresher bread and drank better wine than those of the lower ranks. Novices from wealthy families attended lessons in Latin grammar and scripture, their futures secure within the church or in positions of influence. Meanwhile, Arnaud and the other servant boys slept in a dim hall near the stables, wrapped in rough blankets that barely kept out the cold. It was a world defined by inequality, though as a child, Arnaud lacked the words to describe it. He only felt its sting. By early spring, a new figure emerged in Arnaud's life, Brother Matthew, a monk recently transferred from a neighboring priory known for its strict enforcement of discipline. Matthew believed in the absolute obedience of servants and took special interest in enforcing the abbot's reforms. He watched Arnaud closely, often standing in the shadows of the cloister, arms folded beneath his heavy wool sleeves. His presence unsettled the boy. Whereas Gautier had been stern but predictable, Matthew was unpredictable, responding to the smallest infraction with sudden severity. One afternoon, while Arnaud carried a bundle of linen to the laundry, he stumbled on the uneven stones of the courtyard. The linens scattered over the ground, picking up dirt and melted snow. Before he could gather them, Matthew seized him by the arm. Without raising his voice, Matthew declared the mistake a sign of carelessness and assigned Arnaud an extra week of night work. Gautier, witnessing the event from the cloister archway, said nothing. Authority in the abbey was absolute, and no monk would risk confrontation with a man favored by the abbot. It was during these late night assignments that Arnaud first began to sense the toll his life was taking on him. Alone in the stables, he brushed down horses until his arms ached. In the storeroom, he stacked firewood until he could barely lift his hands. Outside, under the pale light of the moon, he fetched water from the well, his breath rising in white clouds. He felt the world shrinking around him, every corner of the abbey becoming both familiar and confining. His body grew leaner, stronger in some ways, yet more fragile in others. Childhood slipped from him like sand through a sieve. Still, there were moments of small triumph that kept him going. During Easter preparations in April, the abbey welcomed a visiting bishop from Toulouse. Master Hughes assembled the choir for the Grand Mass, and Arnaud was placed in the front row. When he lifted his voice in the solemn chant, the sound resonated through the vaulted ceiling, filling the church with a purity that caused even the bishop's retinue to pause. For a brief moment, Arnaud felt seen, not as a servant, but as someone who could create beauty. The bishop remarked afterward that the abbey possessed an exceptional young chorister. Abbot Bernard accepted the praise as though it reflected his own efforts. But praise brought problems. Brother Matthew, who believed that servants should be unnoticed, began watching Arnaud with increased scrutiny. Perhaps he resented the idea that a low-born boy could attract admiration. Perhaps he viewed talent as a threat to discipline. Whatever the reason, his treatment of Arnaud hardened. A missed chore resulted in a reprimand. A moment of hesitating speech earned extra work. A single out-of-tune note during rehearsal led to hours spent kneeling in the chapel as punishment. Arnaud endured silently, determined not to lose the one place where he felt meaningful, the choir. The dynamic at the abbey shifted again in midsummer when news spread of a famine threatening nearby villages. Crops had failed in several regions due to heavy rains. The abbey's grain stores became more tightly guarded, and fear crept into the community. Hungry villagers arrived at the gates seeking charity, but Abbot Bernard, prioritizing the monastery's stability, ordered the gates closed to most petitioners. Arnaud witnessed the desperation firsthand. On one afternoon trip to the garden, he saw a mother pleading for bread while holding a child whose ribs showed through his skin. The monks refused her, turning her away as though she were an inconvenience. The sight stayed with Arnaud long after she disappeared down the road. During this period, the abbey tightened its rules even further. Servants were ordered to sleep fewer hours. Monks blamed laziness for the shortages, insisting everyone must labor to protect the abbey's sacred stores. Arnaud's voice began to weaken under the pressure. Master Hugues grew frustrated, forcing him to repeat chants again and again until his throat burned. Still, the boy obeyed, knowing resistance would only worsen his fate. One night in August, as Arnaud scrubbed the floor near the refectory, he overheard two monks discussing rumors circulating throughout southern France. Tales of mistreatment of monastery servants were spreading, and several noble families had begun questioning the church's use of young boys as laborers. The monks dismissed the complaints as political meddling, but Arnaud felt a flicker of curiosity. Could people outside truly care about children like him? Could someone speak for those who had no voice? But such hopes were fragile. The abbey remained a closed world, governed by its own rules, and inside that world, Arnaud's life was drifting toward a breaking point. The reforms, the fatigue, the constant pressure. It was more than any child should endure. Yet the harshest chapter of his life had not yet begun. A single event, unexpected and devastating, would soon reshape the trajectory of his existence. Autumn of 1289 arrived with a darkness that settled early each evening, casting long shadows across the abbey walls. The air grew sharp, leaves fell into brittle heaps, and the monks prepared for the coming winter by increasing the pace of work. For Arnaud, now nearing 11 years old, this season marked the beginning of the most painful turning point in his life. The hardships of the past seemed small compared to what waited ahead. By late October, the abbey had begun preparations for All Saints' Day. It was one of the most important feasts of the year, and Abbot Bernard demanded that every detail reflect the prestige of Saint Martial. Master Hugues drilled the choir relentlessly. The chants were long and complex, requiring flawless breath control, precision, and perfect harmony. Arnaud, though gifted, struggled under the growing strain. His voice had begun to crack slightly, not the natural deepening of adolescence, which was still years away, but a stress fracture caused by exhaustion, cold, and overuse. Hugues noticed immediately. During rehearsals, he would pause, fix Arnaud with a cold stare, and order him to repeat the same phrase until no imperfection remained. Others in the choir whispered among themselves that the boy was losing his skill. A few resented the attention he had once received from visitors. Now they watched his decline with an unsettling satisfaction. The night that changed Arnaud's life began 3 days before the feast. The bells had barely finished ringing Compline when Brother Matthew appeared in the servants' hall, calling Arnaud by name. The boy rose from his blanket, heart quickening. Matthew rarely came this late, unless something serious was expected. He ordered Arnaud to report to the chapel for extra practice. Master Hugues waited inside, the candles casting wavering light across his stern features. The choir stalls were empty, and the silence felt heavy. Hugues instructed Arnaud to chant the opening lines of the antiphon. The boy obeyed, but midway through the third line, his voice cracked sharply, echoing through the stone chamber like a snapped reed. Hugues's reaction was swift and merciless. He slammed his wooden staff against the floor. He accused Arnaud of negligence, of failing to care for the gift God had given him. The choirmaster believed the boy's struggle was not physical but moral, a weakness of discipline. Matthew, standing in the shadows, nodded approvingly at each harsh word. Arnaud tried to continue, but his throat was raw. Each attempt ended in a strained rasp that fell far short of the purity he once carried. Hugues dismissed him in disgust, declaring he was unfit for the sacred chants of the feast. For Arnaud, the blow was devastating. Singing had been the one part of abbey life that gave him a sense of meaning. Now it had been ripped away by circumstances beyond his control. The punishment came the next morning. Before sunrise, Brother Matthew summoned Arnaud and informed him he would be reassigned temporarily from the choir to physical labor until his voice recovered. Gautier protested quietly, suggesting the boy needed rest, but Matthew silenced him with a glare. Arnaud was sent to the granary, where he spent hours carrying sacks of barley. The work was grueling, and each sack seemed to press the air from his lungs. After 3 days of this relentless routine, Arnaud's body weakened further. His legs trembled beneath him, his arms barely lifted the sacks, and his throat burned each time he swallowed. Worse still, the monks began whispering that his loss of voice was divine punishment, a sign that the boy had displeased God. Medieval communities often interpreted illness or weakness as spiritual failure, and children were rarely spared such beliefs. On the night before All Saints' Day, something happened that would mark Arnaud forever. Matthew entered the granary where Arnaud was finishing his last task. The torches flickered against the wooden beams. The monk approached him quietly, his expression unreadable. He asked Arnaud why he had failed in the choir. The boy, frightened, explained that he was simply tired. Rather than sympathy, Matthew took this as defiance. He insisted that Arnaud must learn obedience not only in body but in spirit. Then, in a cold and controlled tone, he ordered the boy to kneel. Arnaud obeyed. Matthew assigned him an overnight penance. He was to remain kneeling in the side chapel, praying until the bells rang for matins. The chapel was unheated, its stone floor freezing. Arnaud knelt there alone, whispering prayers between chattering teeth. As the hours passed, his body stiffened, and the pain in his throat worsened. He tried to stand once, but collapsed from weakness. Still, he continued praying, fearing that any attempt to leave would result in further punishment. When dawn finally approached, the bells rang for matins, echoing through the corridors. Arnaud attempted to rise. His legs were numb, and he leaned heavily on a pew to pull himself upright. He stumbled to the choir entrance, hoping to join the others, but when he opened his mouth to chant the response, only a faint rasp came out. His voice was gone, completely. Master Hugues stared at him in shock. Brother Matthew looked almost satisfied. Arnaud was dismissed from the choir permanently that morning. Deprived of the one role that gave him dignity, he was returned to full-time labor. His voice, once praised by bishops, was now a ghost of itself, a reminder of what had been taken from him by exhaustion, cold, and cruelty. The consequences were immediate. Without his position in the choir, he lost privileges he had not even realized he possessed. Choir boys were given slightly better meals, warmer cloaks, and occasional time to study simple psalms. All of this vanished. Arnaud slept again among the lowest servants. He worked from before sunrise until after dark. He was no longer special in the eyes of the abbey, but something had changed inside him. For the first time, Arnaud began to question the world he lived in. The rituals, the hierarchy, the discipline, all of it had been presented as divine order. But now he wondered, if God cared for the innocent, why had he allowed this? Why had a place meant to shelter the poor become a place of suffering for a child? These questions lingered like smoke in his thoughts. In medieval Europe, questioning the Church's moral authority was unthinkable, especially for a servant boy. Yet Arnaud could not silence the doubts forming within him. His tragic path was narrowing, and the decisions of the abbey would push him toward a fate sealed not by destiny, but by human choices. The winter ahead would be the darkest of his life. The winter of 1290 arrived early, harsh, and merciless. Snow covered the roofs and cloisters of St. Martial Abbey in thick layers, muting the sounds of daily life and turning every breath into a cloud of white. For Arnaud, now stripped of his choir duties and relegated fully to the harshest tasks, this winter would decide the course of his remaining life. After losing his voice permanently, the abbey's hierarchy saw him differently. To them, he was no longer an asset with potential. He was simply another servant who could be pushed, worked, and forgotten. The monks did not speak of his lost talent. They did not wonder if exhaustion or cold had contributed to his condition. In their records, Boys like him existed only as lines of labor, nameless hands performing endless tasks. By mid-December, Arnaud's duties increased dramatically. He helped unload carts of firewood, broke ice on the stream to collect water, and carried grain sacks heavier than he was. His body, still that of a child, bent under the weight of adult expectations. Each morning he rose before the bells, his breath fogging the darkness as he hurried to begin chores. Each night he collapsed on his straw bedding, trembling with cold and fatigue. Malnutrition gnawed at him. His ribs became visible beneath his skin and his cheeks hollowed further. But it wasn't just physical hardship that made this winter unbearable. It was isolation. Since losing his voice, Arnaud felt as though the monastery had turned its back on him. The choir boys no longer greeted him. The monks no longer acknowledged his efforts. Even Brother Gautier, who had once shown him brief kindness, became distant, perhaps discouraged by the knowledge that he had little power to protect the child. Meanwhile, Brother Matthew's presence remained constant. He watched Arnaud silently, as though waiting for him to fail again. The cold infiltrated every corner of the abbey. Fires were rationed, and the servants' hall rarely received more than a faint glow from a single torch. The grain stores dwindled, forcing rationing among the monks. The servants, however, received little more than scraps. Hunger sharpened like a blade against Arnaud's already weakened body. In January 1290, tragedy struck the region. A wave of illness, likely influenza or a respiratory infection common in cold months, swept through nearby villages. As villagers sought help, the abbey closed its gates, fearing contagion. But the disease did not stop at stone walls. Several monks fell ill, followed by novices and servants. With laborers sick, the few healthy boys were forced to take on even greater responsibilities. Arnaud was among them. He was assigned to the infirmary wing not as a patient, but as a helper. His tasks were grueling, disposing of soiled linens, emptying buckets, fetching herbs and hot water, and watching over coughing, fevered monks who barely recognized him. The infirmary was cold, crowded, and filled with the stench of sickness. The work exposed him daily to infection, but refusal was impossible. Brother Pascal, the infirmary keeper, tried to shield him where he could. He taught Arnaud how to mix herbal infusions of thyme, hyssop, and yarrow, common medieval remedies that offered more comfort than cure. But even Pascal could not lessen the burden. The boy's weakened state made him particularly vulnerable. By late January, Arnaud began coughing, a deep, rattling cough that worsened with each passing day. Still, he worked. No one in the abbey questioned why a sick child continued lifting water buckets. There were no laws, no protections, and no social expectation that the Church must safeguard the young. In medieval Europe, children existed to serve until they could no longer do so. The breaking point came during a storm in early February. One night, the wind roared against the abbey walls, rattling shutters and sending icy draughts through the corridors. Brother Pascal sent Arnaud to retrieve water from the courtyard well. The boy wrapped himself in his thin cloak and stepped into the snowstorm. The cold stabbed at his lungs instantly. His body shook violently as he lowered the bucket. Halfway back to the infirmary, he collapsed. When Pascal found him, Arnaud was unconscious, his small body curled in the snow, arms wrapped weakly around the bucket. They brought him inside, placing him on a straw mattress near the fire. But the warmth came too late. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, and his fever rising. Word spread among the monks, but not with urgency. Servant boys fell ill often. Many did not survive harsh winters. A few monks murmured prayers. Others noted that God's will was at work. Only Pascal remained by the child's side, wiping his forehead and whispering comforting words. Arnaud drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. In his fevered state, he murmured fragments of chants he had once sung in the choir, pure, delicate melodies now emerging as faint whispers. His ruined voice could no longer carry them, but the memories clung to him. On the morning of February 6, 1290, Arnaud passed away. He died quietly, without ceremony, without family. The abbey burial records listed him simply as a servant boy who succumbed to winter illness. His grave was unmarked, placed in the outer cemetery reserved for the poor. No mention was made of his talent, of the gift he once offered the church, or the labor he had given beyond his years. Yet Arnaud's story did not end with his burial. In the years that followed, murmurs of concern began spreading through parts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire regarding the treatment of child servants within religious institutions. Some of these voices came from clergy themselves, men who had witnessed the suffering of young boys but lacked the power to intervene. Others came from local nobles who questioned the practice of sending children to monasteries for labor rather than education. While reforms were slow and uneven, the seeds of change were planted. The tragedies of children like Arnaud helped shape emerging discussions about welfare, charity obligations, and the responsibility of religious houses toward their youngest dependents. These early conversations laid fragile groundwork for later medieval reforms that sought to protect the most vulnerable. Small steps in a society that was beginning to question absolute authority. For centuries, stories like Arnaud's remained hidden in the margins of monastic records. But historians, reading between the lines, recognized that behind the silent entries and nameless graves were real children whose lives reflected the harsh realities of medieval Europe. Arnaud never saw justice. He never saw his mother again. He never regained his voice nor tasted the freedom of youth. But his life, though short and tragic, stands as a testament to the forgotten children whose labor sustained the grand institutions of the medieval church. And through historical reconstruction, their voices, once silenced, are finally heard again,